Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ferry. Welcome to another rebroadcast from the RTB archives.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. Specifically, welcome to our third episode of Recall This Buck, a short series which is designed to explore the curious history of money and the wealth that underlies it. If you haven't yet heard our episodes with Chris Tizan and Peter Brown, you may want to check them out. So our key question today is simple. What is the nature and origin of the glaring and the growing inequality that everywhere defines wealth distribution in the 21st century, both between societies and within them? And perhaps more importantly, as Philip Larkin puts it, why aren't they screaming? He's talking about death, not inequality, but I think the point remains the same. That is, what sorts of stories do societies and individuals within those societies tell themselves so as to tolerate such inequality and the poverty and misery it produces, and even to see that inequality as part of the natural order of things? So I think nobody has been more persuasive in recent years in framing and also in beginning to answer those questions than our guest today, the French economist Thomas Piketty, or Thomas Piketty, as I will try to call him when he appears. I'm John Plotz, and my co-host today is Adaner Usmani, a sociologist currently working on the origins of mass incarceration. You heard him discussing that terrific project back in episode 44. So hello, Adaner.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's great to co-host with you. We will shortly be joined by Professor Piketty, who teaches economics at 3 universities, I discovered, 2 in Paris and 1 in London. He's most famous for his 2013 bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, which analyzed rising inequality in the modern world by proposing fascinating new ways to understand data on income, wealth accumulation, and the changing value of labor. In 2020, he followed that 1,000-page tome with another doorstop of a book, Capital and Ideology. I'm holding it in my small hand right now, which looks at the belief systems that underlie that data and tries to shed light on the question I mentioned above. Where does inequality come from, and why do societies naturalize and put up with it? So why aren't we all screaming? Okay. Adaner, we've got a few minutes here, so I want to do this kind of color commentary style, like announcers before the big match as the players approach the pitch. What are your expectations for today's conversation? What are you looking forward to hearing from Piketty, and where would you like to press him the most?
I think I loved your introduction, and I think in your introduction, I think I see a little bit of the difference that you and I have, and I think in some ways, Thomas is probably on your side, since you summarize the argument, I think, very much the way that he puts it, which is that these changes or the lack of change in inequality has a lot to do with the way in which people see the world. And I think my provocation today in today's interview will be that it has less to do with the way in which people see the world and more to do with the incapacity of people to remake the world the way they would like it to be.
So you're saying that we can you're saying that realizing the situation or envisioning the ideological, presuppositions of a society is irrelevant to actually changing it.
I think that would be the strong version of the argument. I think and that version of the argument might apply to something like, let's say, hypothetically, American slavery or something like that. Mm-hmm. Our explanation for the reproduction of American slavery over time might be that slaves accepted slavery, but it might also just be that slaves didn't accept the rule of their slave owners, but were forced to accept it by the fact that they had no means to challenge the rule of slave owners. The other way, the slightly weaker argument, which I think is still compatible with my general approach, is to say that people might come to accept the rule of slave owners, but in the end, that's simply a consequence of the fact that they have no ability to challenge slave owners. So it's a rationalization of their domination. It's a rationalization of their powerlessness, in which case it does no independent explanatory work. It's just the kind of mediating cause between their powerlessness and the stability of the world.
But can I just ask you how you have thought about the set of race and slavery questions that I proposed asking him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, how did you put it exactly?
I mean, I just kind of wanted to know where the line of causality was, because I feel like, do you understand slavery as producing racial
Right.
ideologies, or do you
Right.
think of race thinking as, legitimizing and opening up the door to slavery?
Well, the way that you just put it there, I think both of those things could be
They
true.
could. They
well,
could
I mean,
both
as
be
in,
true.
like, race could definitely legitimize racial ideology. I think certainly had the function of legitimizing slavery. I think the question I might ask is, in whose eyes and for whom? That's one of the bigger questions I have about ideology in his book, is that he seems to want to argue that ideology is about convincing the ruled, not simply the audience of ideology is the ruled. But for slavery, that seems particularly weird in some ways, right? Is it the case that racial ideology really convinced slaves to be reconciled to slavery? I'm not so sure. I'm not sure how he would answer that. I think it's a great question.
I guess the other set of questions I have, but they're harder to ask, it have to do with like the long tail of slavery. So in other words, if you think about wealth distribution in the United States and its profoundly racial nature, like how do we link that to the legacy of slavery? Like, do we see it as coming out of the proprietarian ideologies of the 18th century, or is it something that's more ongoing in the present day? And if so, what's the account of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. But I mean, to the extent that, do you mean something more than simply, is it the simple consequence of the fact that after slavery, because of slavery, white people had such a disproportionate share of America's wealth, and then you sort of just run the American experiment forward and that's what continues? Is that kind of the question? Or is there specifically an ideological element that makes it difficult to challenge?
Yeah. The question is how much the ideological or cultural elements are kind of ongoing and sustained on a daily basis in ways that are decoupled from the slavery of the past, versus, just as you said, a machinery that just trundles forward because Black people were on the underside of the wealth gap.
Right. I think it's a good question to ask Piketty, because cross-nationally, this becomes, I mean, if it's the case that we see that it's difficult to challenge slavery, challenge wealth inequality everywhere, it would seem that America-specific explanations might need supplementing, because it can't simply be things that are specific to America that make it difficult to challenge wealth inequality, because everywhere is having trouble challenging wealth inequality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I really value I think the chapters on Haiti and the way that the debt was calculated, the ongoing debt of slavery, the so-called compensation for slave owners, like that was still being paid off from Haiti, is just an amazing question. Okay, so I'm going to admit him and we're going to
Fantastic.
Go. Okay. I hope.
Hello.
Bonjour.
Hello.
Okay. Merci beaucoup et merci pour parler anglais. We really appreciate
it. Okay.
I know. Thank you so much. So I'm John Plotz. I'm the one who emailed with you, and my colleague will ask the first question, I think.
Okay.
It's a real pleasure to have you. Thanks very much for being here. We're just going to jump right in, if that's okay.
Okay, let's go.
So one of the things that I really admired about Capital and Ideology was the way in which you tackle both analytical and normative questions. So you give us an account of the evolution of inequality over time and place, but you also tell us very forthrightly about what we should do about it, about what governments should do about it. I wonder if you could speak, just to start, a little bit more about the relationship between kind of the descriptive and the prescriptive in your book.
This is a book about the history of inequality regime. And as you know, one of the main conclusions is that this history is primarily determined by political forces, ideological forces, because all human societies and all, actors and both, at the bottom of society or at the top of societies, are trying to give meaning to equality and inequality and to make sense of the world they live in. And so it's not, I did not invent, normative perspective on inequality. People have a normative perspective on inequality. And to me, it would be sort of strange if as a scholar, I would sort of put myself outside of society and just, so, of course, I'm trying to have some distance because, I'm very fortunate to have a job where, I can spend days and weeks and months just reading books and working with data. I can look at historical periods which are now very far away from us. So it's possible to put a distance. But I think at some point we have to. We're so fortunate to do this job as academic. We have to try to return a little bit, from what we have received.
I mean, I love the book in general, but one of the things I love most is your account of the slave societies and their intimate integration into the proprietarian ideology. And I wanted to kind of ask you, it may be an impossible chicken and egg question, but it's about slavery as a vital ingredient of modern proprietarian ideology. That is, do you see slavery as a necessary, is it a necessary component that makes those ideologies fall into place, or rather does the existence of those ideologies enable slavery to arise in the extreme forms that you see in the slave societies?
Again, it all happened together, so it's difficult to disentangle. But I think, you can imagine an industrialization process and a development process without slavery. I think it was not necessary. It was, you can imagine, with a world where a different balance of power, both material and ideological, with different state power in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in America, would have led to a form of international economic development with a more balanced distribution of power across society, so that you don't have forced labor going from Africa to it would have been a pretty different world. But technically, you could have had the Industrial Revolution with a very different distribution of the gains from industrialization. So, the slaves, instead of being slaves, could have been, free workers getting higher wages and maybe moving to America because they wanted to have higher wages, which would have implied that the capitalists, of course, and the slave owners would have had a much lower living standards and much lower capacities to accumulate capital for themselves than what they had. But this does not imply that then capital accumulation could not have taken place. Capital accumulation could have taken place in a more collective manner and in a less unequal manner. We know from the 20th century that the reduction of inequality is not bad for growth and for capital accumulation, because even though people at the top accumulate less, you can have more capital accumulation by the middle class, and we also know that more collective forms of accumulation, starting with human capital, education, are very important in the long run, and you certainly don't want this to happen only within a very small group at the top. So in principle, you can imagine a different 18th century, 19th century, where things would have happened completely differently. Now, this would have required a balance of power between states. So here, it's more than ideology. I want to stress in my that in my book, the balance of power, in particular between states, and the relative power and relative state capacities that develop at different rhythm in different parts of the world are absolutely critical for everything that happened. But at the same time, this balance of power itself comes with the rise of different ideology, which allows this different process of state centralization and state construction to assert themselves and to legitimate themselves. And when they come into conflict, the trajectories and the bifurcations that will be chosen out of these times of crisis are very indeterminate. They do not just depend on a pure balance of powers; they also depend on ideology. So anyway, I mean, we can imagine a completely different world that was when we saw. This requires quite a lot of imagination, and in the specific trajectory that was taken, then of course slavery played an absolutely central role. Just the vast majority of the cotton used in the textile manufacturing in the 19th century, Britain or European or North American plants, came from slave plantation, in particular from the U.S. South. So, technically, this was absolutely central to the process.
So I guess I have one final related question about that slavery question, which is, as an American, we can't help thinking about the racial legacy here. I know it's different in other countries, but everywhere around the world, one of the legacies that slavery has left is racialized thinking. And I just wonder, again, it's probably hard to answer question about causation, but how race and racialized ideology fits into your sense of both of the legacy of slavery and how much we understand current racial configurations as coming out of that slavery configuration of the early modern period, and how much you would account for it by other mechanisms or other means.
I think both in the US, but and more recently in Europe, we have been. We've tried to forget and we've tried to neglect, how important, this legacy was. And but I think we have to confront this legacy. And I try to, in my book, I try to show that, there's a discussion about reparation, which we need to have, together with a discussion with sort of a more universal perspective on economic justice for the future. But we need to articulate the two logics. So in terms of reparation, I think it's not only in the US. Well, in the US, it's striking that US Congress voted in 1988 a law to transfer $20,000 to all Japanese Americans that were still alive in 1988 and that were interned during World War II. Somehow, the African Americans who were subject to segregation until the 1960s, so they were not in jail for 1 or 2 years, but sometimes for 20 years, 30 years of their entire life, they could not walk on the same street, go to the same school. This is a serious, prejudice and a serious, and it would have made sense in 1964 or in 1988 or today, to have a similar kind of symbolic reparation and not only symbolic, some material dimension, and it would have made even more sense, of course, in 1865. And as a promise actually was made at the end of the Civil War that they would receive, 1 mule and 40 acres of land. And of course, this promise was never applied. But France received, the French state received from Haiti huge payment for almost 1 century and a half, between 1825 and 1950, in order to compensate, the slave owners in France, in metropolitan France, which had lost their property because of the independence of Haiti. And when people in France today say, oh, this is a long time ago, it's too late. Well, okay, it's too late, except that, there are expropriations that took place during World War II or sometime even during World War I, which we're still compensating today, and probably rightfully so. But then if you refuse to have a discussion about Haiti or racial segregation in the US, then you are in troubles, because then you give people the feeling that the notion of justice that you're trying to build is not really fair, is not treating different prejudice and different discrimination in the same way. And I think a big part of the difficulties we have, just to live together today, if you think of the issue of anti-Semitism, the issue of attitudes toward Islam, the issues of racial conflict in the US. A big part also of this conflict have to do with our difficulties to come with a notion of justice in terms of reparation for past prejudices, whether they happened during World War II or during slavery or during colonialism. Some people in my country, in France, still believe that, this is a US problem and that in France, this is not an issue. But, segregation, it's not only the payment from Haiti, segregation in the colonial empire or in Algeria until the 1960s was in many ways comparable to that in the US South. And this is something which people have had a hard time confronting. At the same time, we need to look at the future. And so when I propose a minimum inheritance for all, 120,000 euros at the age of 25, this is really for all. Whether your ancestors were slaves or slave owners, everybody will receive 120,000 at age 25. So I think we need to do both. We need to have some specific reparation, sometimes symbolic, pedagogical, museum, sometimes material for some specific injustices of the past, and at the same time, look at the future of universal redistribution mechanism, which will, in practice, benefit a lot to the people who come from the minority groups, which are still, very much concentrated in the lower socioeconomic groups of societies, either minority members of US society or, post-colonial migrants in European societies. But we need to have both the reparation and the universal perspective on economic justice. And that's the difficult part, because very often people want to hear only about one or only about the other. And finding the right balance between the two is very complicated.
Mm-hmm. So, Thomas, as you said a little earlier, one of the really striking things about the book is that the way in which you tell the story of the rise and fall, or fall and rise and hopefully fall again of inequality, is centrally about the way in which people see the world, about ideology, about ideological change. So when people see it differently, the world will change. And when people simply swallow ruling ideology, the world is not likely to change very much at all. There are two ways in which someone could criticize this argument, which I was hoping we could explore. The one criticism is that this argument overstates the extent to which people, in fact, accept ruling ideologies. So I guess the question that I would ask is, what evidence do we have that people, in fact, accept ruling ideologies and have accepted ruling ideologies over the course of history? It could just be that they don't have the means to rebel against their superiors. Under normal circumstances, it would be kind of foolish for slaves to try and overthrow slave owners, peasants to challenge landlords, workers to challenge capitalists. So what evidence do we have that people at the bottom of social, political, economic hierarchies actually accept ruling ideologies versus simply being unable to change the world that they inhabit?
Yeah, I think it depends on which situation we have in mind. In the case of slavery, I'm not saying that slaves ever accepted, the ideology that they should be slaves. So I think here there's something different, which is the mobilization capacity, the risk you take in case of a revolt. Although, in the long run, for instance, the rise of literacy, family life, and then literacy among US slaves also, facilitated the mobilization capacity. So, it's even there, it's important. But what I generally speaking, okay, slavery is really the extreme example where you don't need to have a very sophisticated counter ideology to be against the ideology of slavery when you are a slave. But in more subtle inequality ideologies, including the ternary societies, the trifunctional societies that I study, before the French Revolution and before the 19th century, or the proprietarian ideology of the 19th century and early 20th century. it's not so easy to find an alternative. I mean, there are alternatives which have been developed. Socialist, various brands of socialist and communist ideologies were developed in the 19th century in order to serve as an alternative to the proprietarian ideology. But as we now know, some of these ideologies sort of had a platform that sort of worked, and some other segments of these ideologies, in effect, it didn't work so well. So this illustrates very clearly that the finding a counter ideology is usually not so simple, and that's really what I want to stress in the book, is that I think there's always a tendency in the left, to think, okay, we sort of know what we should do, and the only problem is that we have sort of a group of very powerful people who don't want this to happen. So all what matters is the balance of power. And I'm not saying the balance of power is not important. I'm not saying that you don't have people who are trying to protect what they have. That's obvious. But the problems that we are trying to solve are not simple, and we know from history that the pure balance of power in 1917 in Russia, the balance of power allowed, the rise of a completely different kind of state, a proletarian state instead of a proprietarian state. But, in the end, this balance of power, led to the development of a set of institutions and rules, which did not lead to the emancipation of the working class that they were supposed to lead. So and I don't think, I think things could have happened differently. Things, a different coalition, a different group of people, a different, it was not written in advance that it would happen like this. And other socialist movements, when the Social Democrats in Sweden take power in 1932, they develop a different kind of institution, ideology, starting from a different starting point, of course, but still, I show in the book, Sweden was not a nice egalitarian place to begin with. It was an incredibly inegalitarian place, different from Russia, of course, but it was not written from the beginning that things would need to go in such different direction. So political and ideological mobilization was critical in both cases and will be critical in future bifurcations.
Finally, I wanted to ask, as Americans, we feel like we have to ask a question for you about how you view the last 4 years of President Trump, in terms of where the developments are, like whether we see an advent of some kind of new ideology, like a new turn in the neo-proprietarian, or is it just shifting deck chairs? Could this be as big as Thatcher and Reagan?
I'm not so sure. You have to see that from a European perspective, we've already seen a little bit something like Trump when we had Berlusconi in Italy, probably something that comes close. It's not the same, but it comes relatively close. Except of course that Italy is not the superpower of the world, and so it was much less important, and we talk much less about it. But and probably in the US you didn't talk at all about it.
No, we talked about it.
But in France, where we are much closer to Italy, it was quite impressive. When Berlusconi came to power, and that was already 30 years ago. And Italy is interesting because it's sort of it's very close to us, when we are in France, and at the same time, that's the level of sort of complete decomposition of the political system, of the post-war political system, is in a way much more advanced. Well, advanced. I'm not sure we will all go in this direction, but unfortunately, that's not completely impossible. And so anyway, so what I mean is that it's not. But the institutions, yeah. the federal institution in the US, of course, have lots of problems. I mean, the good news is that I don't know if it's a good news for the US, is that European federal institutions have even more problems. Are even more problematic. But it's clear that the voting system, the electoral system, the way votes are being counted, is problematic. And this was, look, in the end, Trump was of course awful and a terrible president, but to me, as compared to George W. Bush, who went to war in Iraq and who caused, 500,000 dead in Iraq after 2003, 2004 in the Iraq war. In a way, Trump was less damaging. At least I understand that for you in the US, you view Trump as a more damaging. But I think if we take a world perspective, I mean, this could have been worse. He could have, if he had used the US military to do things, it could have been worse. For us in the rest of the world, the fact that he didn't use the US military to do terrible things, after Vietnam, after Iraq, the question is, when is the next time that America will use its military to do very bad things? And at least Trump was not the answer to this question.
Can I ask the question in a slightly different way, though? One thing Adaner and I agree on in loving about your book is the critique of the Brahmin left parties. So I guess I wondered whether you see Trump. One way to read Trump would be as a vindication of your analysis of the hollowing out of the left side of the American political spectrum.
Oh yes, no, of course, you're perfectly right. No, I think, but Trump, a little bit like Berlusconi, is both are the testimony of this sort of conflict between the intellectual elite and the business elite that I described. So to me, that's exactly the embodiment of this. I think what makes Trump possible, and what makes it possible for Trump to claim in a sort of quasi-plausible manner that is against the elite, in spite of the fact that he is a billionaire, in spite of the fact, like Berlusconi. So what makes it possible is because, indeed, there is another elite, which is not the business elite, the billionaire elite, which is the PhD elite, which is the intellectual elite, which indeed votes massively for the other side. Now, this was not true, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, where all the elite would vote for the Republican Party, or for the right-wing parties, or a conservative party in Europe. So at that time, it would have been completely ridiculous for a billionaire, to claim to be against the elite, because his entire political coalition was an elitist political coalition. So it would have made no sense. So I think what makes Trump possible today is this conflict between elite and the fact that the Democratic Party in the US, has become a party of elite, and I think partly because the Democratic Party is not doing a lot to reduce inequality, and in the end is serving the interest of the educated elite and the children of the educated elite, with more attention, or at least as much attention as it is serving the interest of the poor. And this, I think when I read the New York Times and I read, I don't see a lot of sort of self-questioning about that. I see, people who are very upset against Trump and the Republican, and of course, I can understand this, especially, these recent weeks, but I think it's important, if the Democratic Party wants to be able one day to regain confidence of socially disadvantaged voters from all origins, which was more or less the case in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whether they are black or white or, whatever their ethnic origin, if the Democratic Party wants to regain confidence of this voter, they will have to sort of be a bit less self-confident in the idea that they've done everything right and they they don't have to change anything to their policy platform, and it will take a very, very long time. And from this perspective, this election of 2020 is very much, I have tried to put the 2020 in the continuation on my graph for the US for after the 2016 election, and it looks, it's very much in the continuation of this long run, rise of the Brahmin left and the merchant right graphs that I have in the book.
Yes. Okay. Well,
fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We're very grateful for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope to see you in Boston for Rio. Okay.
Okay. Well,
thank you very much.
That's awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So what do you think?
I thought he was great. I mean, I thought it was very typical of interviewing, celebrity intellectuals, which is that he has a lot of stuff to say. He said a lot of it before, but as he talked, even not necessarily with our own interlocutions, he developed, unexpected angles. So there were many things he said that I was pleased to hear. Yeah. What did you think?
Yeah, I thought something similar, which is that I think it's always a difficult form of engagement because he comes expecting to give sort of responses that he's given before. And I think he was expecting questions like, summarize the book's argument.
My brother who interviewed famous people for a long time calls it Control F5. Like you just have the cut and paste answer that you just drop in there and then you're done.
Yeah. But I thought he went sort of furthest from that in the discussion in response to your question about slavery and proletarian ideology. I thought that was interesting to hear.
Though actually, Adaner, I was going to say, I thought the thing that he said about slavery that was the best was the way he continued to think it through in response to your question about change, like whether ideology was pervasive even at the bottom. Because he said, okay, he took your point immediately about slavery and mechanisms of control. But then the subtle thing that he added, which I think is totally right, but I've never heard anyone put it in this context, is that like there is actually rising literacy and rising economic opportunity, at least in the border states, for slaves in the 40s and 50s. Like that's actually part of the story. I mean, Frederick Douglass is the metonymy for that.
Yeah,
Douglass is not the only person who manages to go north and is able to kind of be part of whatever Michael Warner calls the evangelical public sphere, that's significant,
absolutely. Yeah. That was interesting. And then, if we had more time, I think I would have asked him to make that distinction that he was making between a certain form of dominance, which is sort of like slavery, I suppose, and these other forms of dominance, because he seemed to want to draw that distinction quite sharply. But I would wager that it's sort of more a continuum. I mean, like life in ternary societies is also full of domination.
Totally. And also the point about, I had forgotten that colonialist is an entire separate ideological structure in his argument. There's like proprietarian, slavery, slave, and colonialist. And I think colonial context would be a great way of thinking about that, right? Because they are on a continuum of exploitative property relations, which is something other than being being owned by another human being for labor, but you're in this position of just like distanced oppression.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if you might extend the argument the same way. I mean, if you think maybe Gandhi here would be the metonymy for this, that when people in colonialist situations of asymmetrical power relation also get access to the weapons of the
absolutely. That exact same argument I think could be made about the Indian nationalist movement. Yeah, Gandhi, Nehru, all of these people I think were in some ways products of certain concessions that the British had begun to make. And then also there was a rise of a Indian labor movement after India started to industrialize under the British in the 19teens and the 20s.
Totally. I think maybe after you can even see in South Africa. I mean, one of the things when Gandhi goes to South Africa, what puts him in a position of power is Indian labor.
Yeah.
No, so I thought he was. I mean, I agree with you that the discussion about slavery was really interesting. But can you just help me parse it as a social scientist? Because I feel like his answer to the question of could it have happened without slavery was something like, well, theoretically, anything is possible. It could have, but it never did. Is that what he was saying?
I think the way that I understood the argument that he wanted to make is that I thought he was directly answering your question, is there a necessary connection between propertarian ideology and slavery, which is, he was replying to say that there is this historical connection, but there in fact is no necessary connection, because you could have imagined exactly the same tenets of propertarian ideology in a non-slave context, in a world without slavery. But I think the evidence for that would be countries that didn't have a slave past.
So that's what I was waiting for. Like I almost wanted to push him, but I was hoping he would just bring up a case. Is there such a case? I mean, it's like
I mean, I suppose various European countries. You could try the Scandinavian countries.
I was just thinking, but they did have serf relations, didn't they?
They absolutely did, yeah. But that would be different, I think, than overseas colonies or slave societies. I think that would be right. But obviously, I mean, one reply could be that there's these ideas migrate transnationally, and so simple as as discrete national histories with discrete consequences. Right. But I think that is what he had in mind without saying it.
Yeah, I think that's.
Do you find that compelling? No.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess. Okay, well, here's where I definitely think he punted. I think he punted on the question of race and like the derivation of the current day forms of racism. Like, I completely agree with everything he said about reparations. I actually thought that it wasn't just that it was eloquent, but the directness with which he linked the legacy of slavery to the need for reparations based on existing structural inequalities is exactly like, it was very well put, and it relates to what you were saying, which is before he came on the line, which is we could understand slavery as part of the mechanism that started things going, and they just trundled along under the same mechanism. So that makes perfect sense. But what he didn't talk about was the kind of cascading consequences of race thinking, like
no, not at all. I mean, I think when you asked that question, you sort of jumped straight to his control F5 policy answer, which is we need both and I think that's what he's been thinking about a lot. There's a lot of that in the book. But you're right that I mean, in his defense, it's not an easy question.
No, of course not. And
it's quite a tricky question.
Right. Anything he said, he would get attacked from, 99 out of 100 sides, because everybody has their own side on it. So we get that point. So do you think that's strategic on his point to just not tackle race except in the abstract?
Well, it's a very compelling answer. And if you want to build sort of goodwill about your policy agenda in intellectual spheres, I think, to say we need both this and this. People have been arguing about this and this, but we need both and I think that in some ways is a compelling way to approach the debate.
I like that point. Well, it's certainly I've forgotten that his amount is 120,000 euros. So it's like it's sort of hard to argue with that, because you're telling everyone, I have a check in my hand for 120,000 euro.
Right. Well, I think it's more than that, right? Isn't it like, it's not a check exactly as much as like a wealth, like a fund that would then accrue over time.
That's right. But
I mean, look, I think if I had wanted to be provocative at that moment, I think the way that I would have tried to do that is to say, in principle, both of these things are really important to demand. But in fact, one of the difficulties that I think he does allude to in his discussion of identity politics is that it is, if you agree that politically agitating for reparations will turn off precisely those elements of the nativist working class that have been attracted by the right, then you have a strategic decision to make that is less comfortable than the kind of argument that he made, which is that perhaps then reparations becomes an obstacle to the kind of universalist. He was sort of saying we can have both, and it's really easy. And that's a really nice answer for an academic. But I think a political strategist would reply to say, no, reparations pull terribly with the white working class. And so they'll run away from our coalition if we foreground reparations.
Interesting. Yeah. So speaking of coalitions, let's talk about the Brahmin left a little bit. What did you, as like, I guess, presumptive members, and it's certainly like beneficiaries of its policy.
Self-flagellating members of the
Exactly, right. Well, it's like that's the defining feature of being a member of the Brahmin left, as far as I could tell. Like, if you ain't self-flagellating, you don't belong. So what do you think? Does his analysis ring true?
Yeah, I mean, I find those graphs in the book some of the most compelling.
Me too. Me too.
compelling empirical material that he presents. Because, I mean, the question that we didn't exactly get to ask him.
Tell our listeners about one of those graphs. Like, what is it particularly compelling?
Yeah, so the graph that he alluded to at the very end, which he said that he had added 2022, shows that the correlation between being college educated and voting for the left has flipped over the last 60, 70 years of American history. So controlling for all the other confounders that you can observe, college educated people used to vote more for the right in like the 40s and the 50s. I can't remember how far his data goes. And now they vote much more for the left. And so there's this evolution then of what he calls the Brahmin left. And he said 2020 sort of continued this trend. And now college educated people are even more likely to vote for the Democrats than for. I find that explanation that the explanation that he offers. So I find the description profoundly fascinating and important. Yeah. But I find the explanation really wanting in the book. The explanation that he offers is something like, I mean, and it's partly because this is a polemic, or not a polemic, but like an intervention into a political debate. He argues in the book, similarly to what he said in the interview, that these politicians of the left have abandoned the working class and turned to these college-educated voters. And so, in other words, it's a choice that political parties have made that they need not have made. Mm-hmm. But I think the fact that this is something that is happening in every single advanced capitalist country, which is what he shows in the book, suggests that it needs to have, we need a deeper explanation than simply a choice that these sort of conniving politicians have made. There's something deeper happening in politics in these countries.
I think that's very fair. Well, thank you, man. That was great.
I really, really enjoyed that. I'm sad we didn't get to ask him. I mean, there was a moment actually where I thought you were going to jump to your Ursula le Guin point.
I know.
More or less making Ursula le Guin's points himself.
Yeah, he really was. I mean, I maybe we'll put that Ursula le Guin quote up in the show notes, because that's definitely. I know. I wanted to do it. I wanted to try to blend Le Guin and Trump into one grand question, but I couldn't get there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Cool.
Pleasure doing business with you.
Yes, absolutely. That was a lot of fun.
Recall This Book is sponsored by the Mandel Humanities Center. Music comes from Eric Cheslow and Barbara Cassidy. Sound editing by Claire Ogden. Website design and social media from Nai Kim. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticism, or suggestion for future episodes. If you enjoyed today's show, which coincidentally was recorded on the morning of January 6th, 2021, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. As well as those earlier Recall This Book episodes with Chris Dizon and Peter Brown, and our conversation with Adaner about mass incarceration, you may be interested in 2 discussions of the January 6th insurrection, one with David Cunningham, the other with Brandeis history professor Greg Childs. From all of us here at Recall This Book, thanks for listening.